The list was folded in thirds. I know that because I watched my mother take it from her purse, that flat leather clutch she kept on the chair beside her, the one she'd carried to every important occasion for the last 11 years, and I watched her slide it across the table toward my sister, without a word. The paper was cream-colored. Her handwriting was in navy ink. I could see from where I sat that she had numbered the items. I could not read them from that distance, but I knew what they were. I had known something like this was coming for almost 2 years. My sister unfolded it. She did not look at my mother. She did not look at me. She read each line in a voice that stayed completely level the whole way through, and when she reached the end, she placed the paper flat on the table in front of my mother's plate, smoothed it once with the back of her hand, and looked up. The room went very quiet after the last word. Welcome back to channel_name, where the quietest moments carry the most weight. My name is Nora Callahan, and this is the story of the night my mother handed my sister a list of 14 reasons to cut me off, and what my sister did with it instead. I grew up in Bellingham, in the kind of house where everything had a right place and a wrong place, and you learned the difference not by being told, but by watching your mother's face when you got it wrong. My mother, Diane, was not a shouting person. She didn't need to be. She had a way of delivering information. A rerouted phone call, a quietly revised dinner invitation, a check that arrived for my sister's birthday and not for mine, that communicated everything she needed it to communicate without a single raised voice. I spent a long time thinking this was a form of restraint. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand it was the opposite. I was 34 when this story begins, living 12 minutes from the house I grew up in, which was not what I had planned, but was what had happened. I worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses along the waterfront, a marine supply company, a bakery that had been in the same family for 30 years, and a commercial photography studio that kept irregular hours and paid me in checks that arrived slightly late every month without fail. I liked the work. It was exact. Numbers either balanced or they didn't, and when they didn't, the error was always somewhere specific, always findable if you were patient enough to look. I had $43,700 in a savings account I'd opened the year I turned 30. I had a husband named Cal, who was a field surveyor and who kept a small green notebook in the left chest pocket of every jacket he owned. I had a sister named Renata, who was 3 years younger than me and who had lived in the same neighborhood as our mother since she was 26. I had, at that point, a relationship with my mother that I would have described, if anyone had asked, as careful. She called on Sundays. She asked about my work in a way that was interested but never specific. How are things going? Are they keeping you busy? That sort of question. She sent birthday cards that arrived on time. She came to the house for dinner 3 or 4 times a year and always brought something. A bottle of wine, a dish towel, once a small potted rosemary plant she had grown from a cutting, and she always said thank you when she left. From the outside, this would have looked like a functioning relationship between a mother and an adult daughter. And it was, in the way that a door can function as a wall if it is always kept closed. The first time I understood what she was actually doing, I was 29. She had been executor of my grandmother's estate. My grandmother on her side, a woman named Edith who had lived in a small house in Mount Vernon and who had died in March of that year after a long illness. The estate was not large. There was the house, which sold for $218,000. There was some furniture. There was a checking account with a few $1,000s and a savings bond my grandmother had purchased in 1991 that had matured to just under $4,200. My grandmother had told me, in the last conversation I had with her, that she had left the savings bond to me. She said it in the way she said important things, directly, without preamble, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea. She said my name, and then she said, "The bond is for you. I want you to have something of mine that came from my own choosing." I thanked her. She squeezed my hand. 6 weeks after the estate settled, my mother mentioned over dinner that the bond had been distributed as part of the general assets. When I said I thought Grandma had intended it for me specifically, she said, "Edith wasn't always clear at the end, Nora. She meant well." Then she asked if I wanted more of the soup. I let it sit. I let it sit for 3 days, and then I called my mother and told her I wanted to understand what had happened. She said the same thing again, in the same voice, Edith meant well. Things weren't always clear, and I understood that there was no version of this conversation where she was going to say anything different. The bond had been $4,200. The point was not the money. The point was that my grandmother had said my name and made a choice, and my mother had undone it without asking me, without telling me, and without any apparent sense that this required an explanation. I did not say any of that on the phone. I said, "Okay." I said, "I understand." And I did understand, not what she had told me, but what she had actually meant. That was the first entry in a ledger I kept only in my own memory because I had nowhere else to put it. The year Cal and I got married, my mother gave a speech at the reception that lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because Cal timed it on his watch, not to be unkind, but because he had started doing that with her whenever she spoke, just to have something concrete to hold on to. The speech was about family. It was about what family meant and what it required, and how certain values were passed down through generations whether we recognized them or not. She said my name 4 times. She said Renata's name once, in passing. Cal reached under the table and found my hand. After the wedding, things shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing with my mother ever happened dramatically. But the Sunday calls got shorter. The dinner invitations that came through Renata started arriving with less notice than they used to. Once, I found out about a family gathering at my mother's house, just dinner. Nothing formal, 2 days after it had happened, when Renata mentioned it offhandedly on the phone. When I asked my mother about it, she said she had assumed I was busy. She had a way of using the word assumed that made it impossible to argue with, because arguing would have required me to prove that her assumption was wrong, and the only proof available was the fact that she hadn't asked. I did not argue. I noted it and moved on. What I want to be precise about, because I think it matters, is that nothing my mother did in those years would have read as cruel to anyone watching from the outside. She was warm. She was organized. She sent cards and brought wine and asked appropriate questions. The architecture of what she was building was invisible unless you were the one being slowly edged out of the floor plan. Cal saw it. He saw it the way someone who comes to a building from outside can sometimes see the structural problems that the people living inside have stopped noticing. He didn't say much about it. That wasn't his way, but sometimes, after a dinner at my mother's house or a phone call that left me sitting with the receiver still in my hand, he would come and stand in the doorway of whatever room I was in and just look at me. Not in a pitying way. In a way that said, "I'm here and I see it too." I kept my own record. Not written anywhere, just a running inventory in my head of dates, incidents, the exact words she had used, and the exact words she hadn't. The $4,200 from Grandma Edith's estate. The dinner I wasn't invited to. The 2 weeks in which, for reasons never explained, my mother had stopped responding to my calls and then resumed as though nothing had happened. The afternoon she had sat at my kitchen table and told me, in a gentle and matter-of-fact voice, that she had updated her estate planning and that she wanted me to know she had made some adjustments to reflect what she called the reality of our relationships. I asked her what that meant. She said, "I just want everything to be fair, Nora." I said, "Okay." I drove home from that conversation with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the particular sensation of having understood something fully that I had been only half understanding for a long time. My sister Renata and I had always been close in the specific way of 2 people who share an origin and have spent years learning to navigate it without discussing it directly. We talked most weeks. We had coffee sometimes at the bakery near her house, a small place with good light in the mornings and a table by the window that we had claimed years ago without ever agreeing to. We talked about her kids, about Cal's survey work, about the clients who gave me trouble, and the ones who didn't. We did not, as a rule, talk about our mother in any depth. This was not because the subject was forbidden. It was because we had both, over the years, arrived at an implicit arrangement. We would not ask the other one to say things that would be difficult to unsay. Renata lived 3 blocks from my mother. She had coffee with her on Wednesday mornings. She was the person my mother called when something needed doing, a ride to a medical appointment, a second opinion on a contractor, the kind of practical assistance that Renata provided efficiently, and without much fuss. I understood the shape of their relationship. I understood my own shape within it. We managed. What I did not know for a long time was that my mother had been managing Renata in ways that Renata was only beginning to understand herself. Renata told me this later, after everything, in the same window table at the bakery, over coffee that had gone cold while we talked. She said she hadn't seen it until she started paying attention to the information she was being given. Not false information, she said. Just information that was always selected. Just enough to produce a particular impression, delivered in a calm voice by someone you trusted, about a person you loved. She said, I thought I was being kept informed. I was being managed. She said it without any particular drama. She looked out the window at the street. I said, I know. She said, I know you know. What neither of us said was how long it had taken us to get here, and what that span of time had cost. 3 weeks before the dinner, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She called at 2:15, which was unusual. She was a Sunday caller, and weekday calls meant something specific. I was at the Marine Supply office, reconciling invoices, and I let it go to voicemail. I listened to it on my lunch break, sitting in my car with the windows cracked, the smell of the waterfront coming in off the sound. She said, Nora, it's Mom. I've been thinking about some things, and I'd like us all to get together for dinner. Nothing formal, just the family. I'll have Renata set something up. Her voice was the same voice she always used for these calls. Warm, organized, a little brisk at the edges. I sat in the car and listened to it twice. I had learned, by this point, to treat that voice the way you treat a weather report you don't entirely trust. The information might be accurate. The forecast might be what it said it was. But you kept your umbrella in the car anyway. I texted Renata that evening. Mom called about a dinner. She said you'd set something up. Renata replied after a few minutes, I know. She called me this morning. I waited. Renata sent another message. I'll tell you when I see you. The dinner was on a Thursday in November, at a restaurant on Cornwall Avenue that my mother liked for what she called its atmosphere, which meant that it had white tablecloths and enough ambient noise to make private conversation difficult to overhear from neighboring tables. She had reserved the small back room. There were 6 of us. My mother, Renata, me, Cal, Renata's husband Doug, and my mother's friend Patricia, who appeared occasionally at family gatherings in a capacity that was never quite explained but that functioned, I had come to understand as witnessing. Cal sat beside me. He had his jacket on, and I knew without looking that the green notebook was in the left chest pocket. My mother ordered wine for the table and asked after everyone's work in her organized way, moving through the questions with the efficiency of someone following an internal agenda. Patricia smiled at appropriate intervals. Doug talked about a project he was working on. Renata was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet, tighter, more deliberate, her hands in her lap. We were between the salad and the main course when my mother reached into the leather clutch beside her chair. The folded paper was cream-colored. She smoothed it once against the table with the flat of her hand before she slid it toward Renata. She did this without announcement, without preamble, without changing her expression. She said, I'd like you to read that. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I think it's important that everyone understands where I stand. Renata looked at the paper. She did not pick it up immediately. My mother said, still in that same warm, organized voice, Go ahead, Renata. It's all right. Renata unfolded it. I could see from where I sat that it was handwritten in navy ink. I could see the numbers along the left margin, 1 through 14. I could not read the words, but I had stopped trying. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I watched my sister's face as she read. She read every line, without stopping. Her expression did not change the way you would expect an expression to change. It settled, instead, into something very still, the kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling but the presence of a decision. When she reached the bottom of the page, she looked up. She did not look at me. She did not look at my mother. She set the paper flat on the table in front of my mother's plate. She smoothed it once with the back of her hand, exactly as my mother had smoothed it before passing it across. Then she picked it up and began reading it aloud. Her voice was completely level. She read all 14 points. She read them the way you read something into a record, clearly, without inflection, without any pause that could be interpreted as emphasis or agreement. Around the table, no one moved. Patricia's smile had shifted into something uncertain. Doug had put his fork down. Cal's hand, under the table, found mine. When Renata finished the last point, she set the paper down again. The room was very quiet.
She said, "Mom."
My mother said, "I think it's important that." Renata said, "I know what you think it's important. I've been listening to what you think is important for a very long time." Renata did not raise her voice after that. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the days that followed, not what she said, but how she said it. The same register she had used to read the list aloud. Steady, deliberate, the kind of voice that has made a decision and is simply reporting from the other side of it. My mother said, "I don't think you understand what I'm trying to." Renata said, "I understand exactly what you're trying to do." The table was very quiet. Patricia had both hands around her wine glass, but was not drinking from it. Doug was looking at the middle distance in the specific way of someone who has decided the best thing he can do is take up as little space as possible. Cal's hand was still in mine under the table. My mother said, "This is a family matter, Renata, and I think if you just—" Renata said, "Nora is my family." She said it the same way she said everything else that night. Not loudly. Not with the kind of weight that announces itself. Just flatly and completely. The way you state a fact that doesn't require elaboration. My mother picked up her wine glass. She set it down without drinking. She said, "I've given this a great deal of thought." Renata said, "I know. That's what worries me." After that, nobody said anything for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued around us, the low murmur of other tables, the sound of someone's cutlery against a plate, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the front of the room. I kept my hands flat on my knees, which was not a decision I made so much as a discovery about what my hands had done on their own. My mother looked at me then. It was the first time she had looked directly at me since the list came out of her purse. Her expression was the same expression she used when she was recalibrating, not angry, not wounded, just processing the new information and deciding what to do with it. I did not say anything. I looked back at her, and I let it sit. She said after a moment, "I'll need some time to think about this." No one at the table offered her any particular response to that. We drove home in silence for most of the way. Not a bad silence. Not the silence of two people who have things they can't say to each other.
Cal drove.
I watched the lights along the bay move past the window, the dark water beyond them, the particular quality of November dark in Bellingham that feels more complete than dark in other places, as though the clouds and the water have agreed to make it absolute. About 8 minutes from home, Cal said, "How are you doing?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That sounds about right." I went to work the next morning and balanced invoices for the Marine Supply Company for 3 hours without stopping. The numbers were clean. Everything came out even. There is a particular satisfaction in that kind of work that I have never quite been able to explain to people who don't do it. The way the world narrows to a specific and solvable problem, and the solution is always there if you look carefully enough, and when you find it, you know immediately and without any doubt that you have found it because the columns match and the difference is zero. I had lunch at my desk. I thought about the list. I had not read it. Renata had not shown it to me that night, and I had not asked. I found I didn't need to. I knew the general architecture of it, the way my mother thought about things, the categories she would have used, the logic she would have applied. 14 points in navy ink on cream paper. I could have written most of it myself. What I thought about instead was the image of Renata's hands smoothing the paper back down onto the table in front of my mother's plate. The deliberateness of that gesture. The way it returned the thing to where it had come from. 3 days after the dinner, Renata called me. She said, "I want to show you something." We met that Saturday morning at the bakery. The table by the window was free. The light was doing what November light does in the morning, thin and very clear, the kind that shows everything without flattering it. Renata was already there when I arrived. She had her coffee and mine waiting. Between the cups, on the table, was a manila envelope. I sat down. I looked at the envelope. I said, "What is that?" She said, "Mom sent it to me 2 weeks before the dinner." I said, "What's in it?" She said, "The list. An earlier version. And a cover letter." She let that land. I looked at the envelope. The light came through the window at that low winter angle and caught the edge of it. I said, She sent it to you first. Renata said. She wanted me to review it. She said she valued my input. She said she thought it might help me understand some things about you that she'd been worried about for a while. I said, and you didn't tell me. Renata said, I didn't tell you because I needed to figure out what I was going to do with it first. I didn't want to call you in a panic. I wanted to understand what it was before I brought it to you. She looked out the window. Then she looked back at me. She said, I've been her messenger for years, Nora. I didn't always know that's what I was being. But I knew it this time. The coffee was good. The bakery smelled of something with cardamom in it. Outside, someone walked past the window with a dog on a leash, and the dog stopped and looked in at us for a moment before moving on. I reached across the table and put my hand briefly on Renata's arm. She nodded. I picked at my coffee. After a while I said, What did the cover letter say? She said, It said she hoped I would help her find the right time to share this with the family. It said she thought I was the right person to facilitate that conversation. I said, She wanted you to do it for her. Renata said, Yes. I did it differently than she planned. The manila envelope sat on the table between us for the rest of the morning. I did not open it immediately. We finished our coffee and talked about other things, her younger son's school play, a client of mine who kept submitting receipts in no particular order, the fact that Cal had started a small kitchen garden in the back corner of our yard and was treating it with the same methodical attention he gave his survey work. Normal things. The things that make up most of a life. At some point, after the second coffee, with the light shifted to mid-morning, I reached across the table and slid the envelope toward me. Renata watched but didn't say anything. I put my hand on it. The paper was stiff and a little cool from being on the table. I reached in. I took out the contents, 2 sheets of cream paper, the top one folded, the bottom one flat. I laid them flat on the table between us. I unfolded the top sheet slowly, smoothing the crease with my thumb. The cover letter was 6 sentences. Her handwriting, navy ink, the same hand that had written 14 numbered points in the other version. The salutation was Renata, not Dear Renata. She had signed it with her first name only. I read it once, carefully, all the way through. Then I looked up at Renata. Renata said, She wrote it like a work document. I said, She wrote it like a work document. We looked at each other. I said, She asked you to help her present this to the family. Renata said, Yes. I said, And she didn't consider the possibility that you might just read it aloud instead. Renata said very quietly, No. She didn't consider that. I folded the cover letter back along its crease. I put both sheets back in the envelope. I set it on the table. I said, I'm going to call her today. Renata said, Do you want me there? I said, Not for the call, but I'll tell you what happens. I called my mother from the car, parked outside the bakery with the engine off. It was 20 minutes past 11. The bay was visible from where I was parked, a gray strip of it between 2 buildings, the water flat and very still. She answered on the second ring. I said, Mom, I saw the envelope. She said, Renata wasn't supposed to. I said, I know what you wanted Renata to do. I know she didn't do it that way. A pause. Then she said, I was trying to help the family understand. I said, You wrote 14 reasons to remove me from your life and handed them to my sister with a cover letter asking her to present them on your behalf. That's what happened. She said, I don't think that's a fair characterization. I said, You told Grandma Edith that she wasn't always clear at the end. You said that to me at the dinner table, about her own words to me, about the bond she specifically told me was mine. She said, Nora, that was years ago. I said, I know how long ago it was. I know the exact amount it was. I know the dinner it came up and what you were eating and what you asked me after. She didn't say anything. I said, You've been adjusting things for a long time. Estate plans, invitations, what Renata was told, and what she wasn't. I understand why. I think you have your own logic for all of it, and I think it makes complete sense to you. But I'm not going to be managed anymore. She said, I never tried to. I said, You sent my sister a list of 14 reasons to cut me off, and a letter asking her to facilitate the conversation. She said after a moment, I just wanted things to be fair. I said, I know that's what you wanted. She started to say something else. I said, I'm not angry with you. I'm not going to fight about this. But I need you to know that I see it clearly and that I'm going to make my own decisions from here.
She said, What does that mean?
I said, it means I'm going to stay in contact with the people in this family who want to be in contact with me. And I'm going to stop working to maintain connections that were never actually there. She said, This is not how families. I said, I heard you, Mom. I need to go. I said it without slamming the phone down. I put it in my pocket and sat for a minute looking at that gray strip of water between the buildings. It had started to rain. Not hard, just the light, persistent rain that settles in off the sound and stays for days. The windshield was beating with it. I sat there until the rain was steady. Then I started the car and drove home. That was 8 months ago. Here is what the months since have looked like in specific terms. Renata and I talk more now than we did before. Not constantly. She has her life, I have mine, but without the careful navigation that used to take up so much of the space between us. We still sit at the table by the bakery window when we can get it. Her coffee is always waiting when I arrive, and I return the favor when I get there first. We talk about her kids and Cal's kitchen garden and the irregular invoices and all the ordinary things. We also talk sometimes about our mother directly without the old arrangement about not saying things that are difficult to unsay. It turns out that most of those things once said are not as difficult as we had imagined. My mother and I have exchanged 4 phone calls in 8 months. They are shorter than the Sunday calls used to be. She asks how things are going. I tell her. She says she hopes we can find our way to a better understanding. I say I hope so too. I mean it. In the way that you can mean something is possible without being willing to wait indefinitely for it to happen. Cal finished the kitchen garden in September. It produced more tomatoes than we knew what to do with and a quantity of basil that we gave away in paper bags to anyone who would take them. He kept notes in the green notebook, the same one from his left chest pocket, planting dates, growth rates, first and last frost, what worked and what didn't. He showed me the pages one evening at the kitchen table, turning through them while the tomatoes sat in a colander in the sink, and I thought about all the things that become clear when you keep a careful record over time. The envelope is in my desk drawer. I have not done anything with it. I may never do anything with it. But I know it is there and what it contains, and what it means that Renata chose to bring it to me instead of presenting it the way she was asked to. That choice, the small, private, completely deliberate choice to do the thing differently than she was told, is the thing I come back to. Not the list. Not the 14 points in navy ink. What I come back to is the image of my sister's hands, smoothing the paper flat on the table and pushing it back across. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. Some silences carry more weight than any list of reasons ever could. If this story reached you where you needed it to, share it with someone who might need it too. Leave a comment below, and I'll be reading. I'm Nora Callahan, and I'll see you in the next one. The week between the dinner and the Saturday at the bakery was one of those weeks where time moves strangely. I went to work each morning at the usual hour. I balanced the photography studio's accounts, which had been in mild disarray since October, and I sorted through 3 months of receipts that someone had been keeping in a Ziploc bag in a desk drawer. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched the rain. I have a particular memory from that week that I keep returning to, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. It was Wednesday. I was at the Marine Supply office, working through a backlog of vendor invoices, when I came across one from 2019 that had been filed incorrectly, not lost, just in the wrong folder, sitting patiently behind a divider where it had no business being. The amount on it was $7,340. The vendor was a company that had since gone out of business. The invoice was for hardware that had been received and installed and had been functioning without incident for 5 years. There was no reason for the invoice to matter anymore. It had been paid. Everything had been accounted for. But there it was, in the wrong folder, evidence of a moment when something had been put in the wrong place and no one had noticed. I filed it correctly. I noted the correction in the log. I moved on. I thought about that invoice for most of the drive home. My mother had been a secretary for most of her working life, for a civil engineering firm in Bellingham, a job she had held for 22 years before retiring. She was organized in the way that people who have spent decades managing other people's paperwork become organized, Precisely, with an economy of motion, with a clear internal taxonomy for what belonged where. I used to think this was simply her personality. Now I understood it was also her method. You could build a great deal of architecture with careful filing. You could make things appear in the right folder or the wrong one. You could create an impression of completeness while quietly moving certain documents to places where they were unlikely to be found. The $4,200 from Grandma Edith's estate. The dinner I wasn't invited to. The estate plan adjusted to reflect, in her word, fairness. The 14-point list developed over time, refined into its final form, sent first to Renata for review, with a cover letter that used the word facilitate. What I understood that week, more clearly than I had understood it before, was that none of this had been impulsive. Impulsive people shout. They make scenes. They do things in the heat of the moment that they later regret or try to walk back. My mother did not do any of those things. What she did was organized, patient, and fully considered, which was, in its way, more clarifying than anger would have been. Cal asked me on Wednesday evening what I was thinking about. I said, filing systems. He looked at me for a moment. He said, do you want to talk about it? I said, not yet. He said, okay. He went back to the seed catalog he had been reading. He had developed, since starting the kitchen garden, a specific interest in heirloom varieties that had turned into something approaching genuine expertise. I sat across from him at the kitchen table with my tea and thought about folders and what gets put in them and who does the filing. I called my Aunt Louise on Thursday evening. Louise was my mother's younger sister, a woman who had lived in Anacortes her whole life and who had the particular quality of directness that comes from having watched someone closely for a very long time. We had not spoken in nearly a year, not from any falling out, just from the ordinary drift of lives that don't overlap geographically. I told her I was calling to check in. She said she was glad to hear from me. We talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with my mother, and also, carefully, about a few things that did. She said, your mother has always known how to make a plan, Nora. I said, yes. She said, the question is whether the plan was for the family or for herself. I said, I think I know the answer to that. She said, so do I. I've known it for a long time. She asked if I was all right. I said yes. She said to call her more often. I said I would, and I meant it. After I hung up, Cal came into the kitchen for a glass of water and found me sitting at the table with my phone still in my hand. He raised his eyebrows. I said, I called Aunt Louise. He said, how is she? I said, she knew. She always knew. He filled his glass at the sink and came and sat across from me. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was invisible in the dark, just the outline of it, the rough shapes of the beds he had built from cedar planks in October, waiting for spring. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We sat there for a while in the kitchen with the lights on and the dark outside, and that was enough. The phone call with my mother on the Saturday needed more of the room it had actually taken. Let me return to it and be more precise about the silences. When I told her I had seen the envelope, there was a pause before she said anything. Not a long pause. 2, maybe 3 seconds. But in those seconds I could hear her reorganizing, the sound of someone moving the folder to a different drawer, deciding on a new position. She said, Renata wasn't supposed to show you that yet. I said, yet. She said, I meant. I said, I know what you meant. Another pause. Longer. She said, I wrote those things because I care about this family. I said, I understand that's what you believe. She said, everything I've done has been about making sure things were fair. I said, you've used that word a few times. Fair. I'd like to understand what it means to you. She didn't answer immediately. I said, because from where I'm sitting, fair seems to mean an arrangement that you decided on, that you documented, that you presented to Renata for facilitation without asking me any questions at all. She said, I didn't think you would understand. I said, you told me Grandma Edith wasn't clear at the end. Silence. I said, she was clear. She sat at her kitchen table, and she said my name, and she told me the bond was mine. Those were her words. You heard them too. My mother said, quietly, I was trying to protect the family's balance. I said, I know you were. She said, Nora, I hope you know I love you. I said, I know you do. I love you too. That's not what this is about. She started to say something.
I said, I heard you, Mom.
I need to go. And I put the phone in my pocket and looked at the rain on the windshield, each drop arriving separately and then connecting into small rivers that ran down the glass, finding the quickest way to the bottom by whatever path was available. There is one more thing I want to say before I sign off, and it is this. I have spent a lot of years being careful. Careful on the phone.
Careful at dinner.
Careful about what I said and what I noted only in my own memory, and what I simply absorbed and kept moving. I don't regret being careful. It was, for a long time, the only instrument I had for understanding what was actually happening. You can learn a great deal about a situation by paying close attention to it over many years without announcing that you are paying attention. But there is a cost to that kind of carefulness. The cost is that you get very good at accommodating things you should not have to accommodate. You develop a fluency in the language of fine when you don't mean fine, of okay when you mean something is not okay, of I understand when what you mean is I am choosing not to fight about this right now. And that fluency over time can start to feel like the truth. It can start to feel like the shape of your life rather than a set of choices you made under a particular set of circumstances. What Renata did that Thursday evening in the back room of a restaurant on Cornwall Avenue, the choice she made, quietly and without consultation, to pick up the paper and read it in a different direction than the one it was aimed, was the kind of small, specific, irreversible act that I will not forget. Not because it solved everything.
It didn't.
My mother and I are still in the early work of whatever comes next, and I don't know how long that work will take or where it leads. But because it named the thing, in front of witnesses, in my mother's own words, in Renata's own voice, and once a thing is named that clearly it cannot be unheard. The list is in my desk drawer. The rain that day is gone. The tomatoes came and went. Cal's notebook is on to a new season. That is how time works on the things we carry.